Thank you guys for joining. Again, I think it said in the brief, but my goal is essentially for this to be a non-practitioner's guide to cybersecurity. So the reason that I made this presentation was initially because when I started in the field of cybersecurity, I had a day where I had been like pitching a slide deck to a executive from a major bank. And we were walking through a security operations center. And so you think of this as like the very stereotypical Hollywood, like there's a bunch of people hunched over keyboards, noodling around, and it's pretty quiet because there's a lot of people working. And this guy was walking through and he stops and he kind of turns to me and he really quietly said, "So is this where it happens?" And I said, "Is this where what happens?" And he's like, "You know, like where it happens, like where it happens." And I'm like, I'm really completely perplexed at this point. And I'm like, "Could you elaborate a little bit more?" And he says, eventually he's like, "Cyber, like, is this where the cyber happens?" And I'm like, okay, so there is kind of this thought within the industry that either you know cybersecurity or you don't know cybersecurity. You're a practitioner or you're a non-practitioner. So the goal is, even if you guys don't have an advanced degree in software engineering, if you guys are getting a degree in security studies, if you guys are getting a degree in something related to this, thank you so much. You still want to be able to know what you don't know, just enough to be dangerous, just enough to know what kind of questions to ask, because you can either be offensive about it or defensive about it. You can be defensive, and if someone says something like, "The Russians are hacking us," or "Your identity has been breached," you can either say, "Okay, I will go with that information, but I have no idea what to do with that information," or you can say, "I know just enough to ask a couple more questions and to know what I need to know." So as policymakers, as analysts, as all these different things, I want to just have you guys be able to drill into that a little bit more. So just kind of going off of that a little bit more, why is this important? So this is really anything from being able to get a job after this to people that you're going to interact with, you know, today, tomorrow, next week, anytime that you have to deal with people that are not just in your field, but maybe are people that you're going to work with different teams. You might say, right now, I'm only working with this specific team. I'm only working with this type of company, and I have no interest in doing anything cybersecurity related. It might be that you still have to kind of speak their language. Because if you're passionate about this one thing and they're passionate about cybersecurity, sometimes it's really hard to get a software engineer to care about national security in the sense of like that grand strategy. It's a lot easier to get a strategist to say, okay, let's learn a little bit more of like what that technical stuff is. So 3 caveats before I really begin is that, hi Harper, one, any views that I discuss in here are mine. So if I say anything foolish, just chalk it up to me. 2 is that I reference a lot of industry diagrams. I'm not talking about my company or organization today. I'm very specifically just going to be referencing drawing on other people's works. So anything that I give credit to, it's very specifically to say that this is kind of all across industry because this is really a teaching effort. And the last part is that we're going to be really snowballing information because I want this to be the cheat sheet that I never had to enter into cybersecurity. So it's going to start out really grand strategy, then it's going to go into just like a quick hit list of terms. I'm not going to test you on any of this. So if you end up saying, this is not for me, this is too many terms, that's okay. That's really just so you have a vague understanding of like what these kinds of things are and you know where to look in the future, not so much that you need to learn everything today. So that being said, I want to jump right into the fun stuff, which is cyber threat intelligence. So threat intelligence, if you're used to being an intel analyst, a researcher, that kind of thing, when you think of threat intelligence, you essentially look at getting information on the bad guys to do something actionable with it, right? So completely taking out the cyber aspect, you're looking at data that you're collecting, you're processing, you're analyzing it, and you're doing that in order to understand the threat actor, the malicious person's motives, their targets, and their attack behaviors. And so if you think of that last line as just TTPs, their ends, ways, and means, like we learned in our 101 class, this is essentially the same thing. It's just, if you want to move it from threat intelligence to cyber threat intelligence, you just add the word cyber in front of it. So this is doing the exact same thing, You're just now adding the vector of you're using computers. So anyone who's familiar with this concept, either from their daily life or from any SSP class, same thing. I want to really briefly go over the analyst lifecycle with anyone who might not have been familiar with it, anyone who hasn't taken a class already in it. I'm going to slow down for 1 second, but any overall questions about like what we're going to talk about today or anything I've covered so far? Marvelous. So the analyst lifecycle, whether you're working in cybersecurity or you're working on regular tasking, you always start with getting that direction. So you're starting with getting a very specific tasking from a supervisor saying, I want you to find out more information either about this specific thing that is going on within the company, or I want you to find more information about an adversary, or just I want you to find specifically about like this file that appeared on our computer. I want you to chase that down, get more information, see what you can do about that. That's the directioning piece. When you go into collection, that's where you get into the research mode. We are all very familiar with this from writing paper. This is where you're really widening the aperture of your knowledge. You're trying to get as much information as possible. You're not really going for quality as much as you're just trying to grab everything you can. When you move down to that processing piece, the processing is where you then say, okay, what can I do? How can I move just from like this untapped diamond mine to like polishing those gemstones, getting like very specific pieces of information. You can do this as a regular Intel analyst by saying, I'm going to start writing a report, doing that, like number 4, doing that analysis, really trying to dig into what I know about a thing. In cybersecurity, you would do this by using very specific tools to say, I have thousands of indicators. I want to move that down to just a couple that I'm going to focus on. The analysis is, of course, contextualizing, providing more information about a subject. Dissemination is when you have that final report, when you've written it into that like final deliverable, and you're giving it either to, as a student, you've written an essay, you're giving it to a professor. As an analyst, you've written it, you're sending it out to the wider community. And then feedback, which we don't talk about a lot because a lot of times for us, it's we get a grade and we move on. We say, this is something that we've checked the box, we've now completed, and we now no longer have to worry about it. In cybersecurity and intelligence analysis, this is a much bigger step. Because what we're looking at is really saying, okay, now when we've gotten this, do we need to go deeper? Do we need to go broader? What do we need to look at? Do we need to zoom in on this more? Or do we need to say, this is actually something we don't need to worry about anymore. This is actually a false alarm. Cybersecurity is about constantly kind of managing and then remanaging your expectations. What is, like, is something you're looking at valuable? Is it worthwhile? Is it something that you need to change? Is it something that you need to constantly adjust your expectations for, or is this kind of a persistent threat? Again, a lot of similarities with regular analysis work. Only difference here is you're adding computers. The diagram that I'm showing on the right here is how it's kind of discussing that collection and processing piece, how you're going from having a lot of information, gathering as much as you can, and moving that down the funnel into just having intelligence. So one of the very common questions you guys might hear on interviews, and I say that because I've asked this a lot and I've been asked this a lot, is what's the difference between information and intelligence? And so this is a big thing to know in the cybersecurity industry. You have the idea of information is just bits and pieces of knowledge. They're just raw pieces of data. They're things that might be useful and might not. Intelligence is when you've synthesized that information. You've then gotten it to something where you say, this is actionable, I can do something about this. There has been context provided to it. This is something that is going to eventually end up serving me. And so when we talk about cyber threat intelligence, when we talk about threat intelligence, we're specifically not saying threat information, because it's not just about gathering data. It's about gathering points that we can then collate into something very specific that we can use. Does that make sense? Awesome. So moving on to different types of intelligence. We have a couple different things you guys are probably, again, very familiar with in terms of analysis. We've got open source intelligence, OSINT. We have all done this in terms of Facebook, Twitter, looking at things that can be broadly scanned across the internet, and human intelligence, which I know we have specific classes at Georgetown for, but when we're looking at kind of like the more James Bondy, like handling humans, handling operations. Getting into imagery intelligence is, if you think of Google Earth, and then measurement and signatures intelligence. I can never say that one. MASINT. So this is the cool stuff. This is when you get into like lasers and nukes and like all these different things, the information that they're providing to us. You can use these all as a different constellation of pieces of information. Again, you're getting that information and you're trying to pick out the specific pieces that will make the final story that you're interested in crafting. So from this, you can take something like financial intelligence. You can say, you can kind of follow a money trail, and then you can take image intelligence and you can say, all right, I see that all these Russian trains have specifically moved right near the border of Ukraine. And when you put those pieces together, you can start telling a story. The two final pieces that I have down here are FinTel, finished intelligence, is typically what we talk about when we are referencing a report. And a TIP is a threat intelligence. Why can I not think of the word? My goodness. A threat intelligence platform, sorry. And that is in cybersecurity where you go once you have all of those pieces of information and you're trying to put them together. It's essentially the table that you're constructing the puzzle on top of. It's a single place to have all of that information. So getting into the actual threat actors themselves and the TTPs. So we've talked how threat actors are essentially the bad guys. These are the malicious players, whether it's a persistent threat or whether it's a bad guy committing like a ransomware smash and grab type situation. When we talk about TTPs, which is something you'll hear a lot, tools, tactics, and procedures, really think of this as the ends, ways, and means. So in a board game like Clue, you can think of this as saying, it was this guy in this room with this instrument. It is a way of very specifically pinpointing who did it and how they did it and using what methods. The reason that this is important is because you are looking at then saying, okay, if it was done with a hammer, how do we get rid of all hammers, or how do we see all hammers in the future in order to make sure that it doesn't happen again? Or if it was used by sneaking into the conservatory, is there something we can do to lock that door or put other cameras around it? So typically these TTPs are very specific, and we'll get a little bit more into that later. But the biggest thing to know is that threat actors are talked about a lot in the industry, and TTPs are talked about all the time. And really all that is ends, ways, and means. So talking about threat actors. When I first got into the industry, I always assumed that it was bad guys are doing bad guy things because bad guys do bad guy things. After a while, I realized that it really splits into a very specific few categories. The biggest one is financial crime. And I've got an interesting statistic here, if I can pull this up. By 2025, cybercrime is projected to cost $10.5 trillion a year. And the biggest part of that is that a data breach on average costs around $4 million, and the average ransomware payment is around $235,000. So this is something where this would affect any company. This can affect grandma and grandpa if they're getting, photos stolen off of their computer and, they have to pay $20 for ransom, or it can be as big as an entire healthcare system being taken down over something like that. So financial crime, by and large, the biggest thing. This is going to be something where every bank, every healthcare industry, kind of anyone with like a stake in a financial game, which is really anyone in the world, has interest in this from a cybercrime perspective. Espionage is really what we think of at SSP when we are thinking of cybercrime a lot of the times. This is advanced persistent threats, which we'll get to in a bit. This is nation state actors when we are thinking of malicious countries, governments like China, Russia, Iran, countries that typically pay people professionally to consistently try to breach American systems. And we'll get into that further in a little bit, but espionage is one of the very, very big plays here. Critical infrastructure is essentially anything that is necessary for maintaining life. So that can be something like an HVAC system, that can be roads, that can be water supplies, anything where you think, oh, if that was ruined, that would be a huge, huge source to our way of life. That would be a huge issue. So critical infrastructure is a major vector of attack. And that is something that is very critical, especially in the DC area. There's a lot of very specific focus in that. The last thing is hacktivism. It's not talked about so much, and since we're not going to get into things like disinformation here, I'm not going to talk about it as much. But hacktivism is the kind of the big play by supremacy groups. It's saying, I want to get on this site and deface it. I want to do takedowns. I want to do anything that I can in order to make my opponent's views seem less valid, typically by just getting rid of them. So anything you can do to get rid of the site or to make it look less valid is the main play for hacktivism. The last thing I'll discuss on this slide is red teaming. So red teaming is initially, if you think of it in the physical world, red teaming is saying, if I were a malicious actor, how would I kill the most number of people in this building as quickly as possible? So there are a lot of people who will do this for the good guys to specifically say, how do you make your systems more robust? So this is what I started doing as an Intel analyst when I was, before I was in cybersecurity. And that is what I didn't know at the time, was that was just red teaming in the physical world. When you move over to cybersecurity, you do the exact same thing. You say, if I wanted to get into this system and mess up things as quickly as possible, what would that look like? You guys have all done red teaming, whether you know it or not. That's something where if you see a Post-it note with somebody's password, you know, grandma and grandpa have that like under their keyboard, and they think this is foolproof, no one's ever gonna see, and you look at it and you're like, yeah, I could get in. Like I could do things, someone could do that. That's you guys red teaming. That's you thinking like a bad guy. You don't have an intention of being a bad guy, but you think this is something that could go really wrong really quick. So red teaming is an entire sector within cybersecurity. It is specifically to say, if I were a bad guy, what could I do? Any questions so far on anything I've gone over? Wonderful.
How much trillion did you say?
Sorry.
Financial crime?
Financial crime, the projection is 10.5 trillion a year. The left. So because advanced persistent threats are such a big deal for the security studies program, I wanted to get into them a little bit more. So this is the really sexy part of cybersecurity. This is the Russia is hacking our elections, or, you know, we've hacked into, you know, this specific government industry. So what we're talking about when we say APTs, advanced persistent threats, are we're saying nation state level spies. It has to be specifically sponsored by a government organization that is getting into another government. So it's not just that they're getting into a major corporation, a vendor, et cetera. It is one government getting into another government for the purpose of espionage, manipulation, theft, sabotage, any of those really, really fun things. The reason that this is such a major issue, beyond all the obvious things, is that one, it's a very, very long-term game. So the persistence part is that a lot of these operations have taken place over the span of many years, some of which we know about, some of which we don't. Right now, there are 40 APT groups that we have discovered, 6 of which are still active. There are probably many more that we simply don't know about, but we are constantly finding new ones all the time. The way that we find an advanced persistent threat group is that we first find kind of a cluster of different TTPs, so those ends, ways, and means. And we say, this kind of seems like a pattern. We're seeing it over and over again. We start seeing it on different systems, and we say, okay, this seems like it always affects this type of system. We then say, this is actually like, this is really, really sophisticated stuff. A lot of times you'll see that by saying, oh, they have 0 days. 0-day vulnerabilities are vulnerabilities that nobody knows about. It's the difference between saying, hey, the front door of this house has already been broken into, just sneak in like when nobody's looking, or saying there's a hole in the back of this chain link fence around the back. Nobody knows it. Nobody is watching it. And if you sneak in there, you can get into the house that way. When we're talking about zero-day vulnerabilities, we're talking about sneaking in through that back chain fence where no one has heard about it before. They're very expensive. They're very hard because nobody knows to look there. And so governments will pay a lot of money to purchase those zero-day vulnerabilities on the black market because they want to exploit them for as long as possible. Versus saying, okay, everyone already knows that we can exploit it this way. We'll just do that too and hope that, it gets patched, later rather than sooner. Does that make sense to everyone? Awesome. So a couple more interesting things about APTs. Two kind of fun things with this is that with China, we know that they have essentially espionage is not illegal when it is not done in country. And with Russia, hacking is not illegal when it is not done in country. And so there are a couple of things that we look for there. One of kind of like an example of one of the ways that we check for TTPs with advanced persistent threats are if a Russian cannot commit hacking against another Russian, but they can commit hacking against non-Russians, you can say, well, a Russian would use a Cyrillic keyboard. So within any piece of malware, there can be written a specific check to say, if this service, if this computer has a Cyrillic keyboard attached to it, it's probably Russian, leave it alone. However, if it doesn't have a Cyrillic keyboard attached to it, it's probably not Russian, so we're probably good to go. And so that's an example of something where if you see that check for the Cyrillic keyboard, you're thinking both, okay, this is probably Russian, and this is probably, the parameters under which they're operating. So that's an example of some of the things that we're looking for. An example of an APT group. APT 28 is a really interesting one. So again, Advanced Persistent Threat 28. We don't have specific names a lot of times with people who are associated. This group is an exception. We have since discovered specific individuals associated with them. The names that they are also referred to are all on the left. These are not names they call themselves. These are names that cybersecurity companies have given them. There's also, CrowdStrike does these really fanciful images. So APT 28, they've given this really dramatic, cartoonish version that you see on the top right. So they're also called Sednet and Zebra Sea and Frozen Lake and Sophisy and Palm Storm and Strontium, all capital letters, Strontium. So the kinds of things that they've done are they've committed cyber operations against NATO. They've gotten into a US nuclear facility. Again, when we talk about that, we can talk about anything. We can mean anything when we say gotten into, but in this case, we know that they have been monitoring the systems. We don't mean that they've actually been in there tinkering with things, but we know that they have eyes inside of it. And they've gotten into chemicals laboratories. So this is a very wide-ranging group in terms of what they're capable of doing and what they're interested in doing. One of the things you might see here is that it's really interesting that, if they're so powerful, why are they known by so many things? Why do we not have a little bit more information about them? And the big thing is that even within the industry, even when we know that we want to look for very specific things, we simply don't have a good handle on how to organize this very specifically. So this cartoon is just saying, we have too many standards. We should make another standard to standardize all of those standards. And so that's what we've done. And so that's why I think actually as recently as a couple months ago, another standard was created. So now there's 16 versus 15 different ways of categorizing these groups. So it's very difficult to keep track of them. I bring that up because if you're ever in the advanced persistent threat game, in terms of tracking them, in terms of needing to talk about them, you might know them as 26 different things. Someone else might be referencing them. It might be a 27th thing. And the Venn diagrams of what they're talking about can be very difficult. But for the surface level, what you need to know, advanced persistent threats, nation state actors, very malicious, very advanced, very over time, and typically need a lot of research with each one. The next kind of case I'll get into with this, if I can move this slide forward, maybe not.
Do they tend to be have fairly clearly defined lines, so who is one, who's on this team, or is it more of a nebulous Like there are different actors, and you think these ones are kind of like make up this group.
That is a very good question. Sometimes it's very clear in terms of if they have a very specific industry that we know, okay, APT 3 typically always goes for, this type of industry. But sometimes it can be, six different APTs use this very specific indicator of compromise. And I'll get into that in a little bit, like I'll go down that path a little bit more. But the long story short is it depends sometimes. So moving on beyond APTs, kind of similar, but not exactly, is a fin group, so a financial threat group. We talked about FinInt, financial intelligence. This is very specifically people who are looking to play within the carding game. So they're looking at stealing credit cards, trafficking credit cards, using credit cards. They're selling those credentials. So you might see FULZ, FULLZ. That's basically whenever you enter your card online and you have to enter in all that information, the expiration date, etc., versus when you swipe a card and you have that physical transaction, there's different information recorded. Those are all things where if you're selling that online, if you're selling those cards online, basically there's different values for those things. Cards from different countries are worth different amounts. So if you're selling a Canadian card versus a Malaysian card versus a Japanese card, they're worth all different types to different actors. The places in which these cards are sold, there is a market for the market of these markets, because there are so many different credit card schemes that can be perpetrated by these, and also because the fraud tracking has gotten good enough that now we realize pretty quickly when it's happening. So essentially financial groups, not as big of a deal as the APTs in terms of there's not as much focus on them, but still big to know in terms of there is a very booming business with financial threat, because again, when you think of people's credit cards, you think of how much money you can quickly exfiltrate. So that is a big thing in and of itself. So next I want to get into the cyber kill chain. So this is Lockheed Martin's idea of essentially how does a malicious threat actor get into a system? How does it commit damage? And then how does it get out of the system? So this is very similar to what you would see for a physical threat actor. We don't have something written precisely like this, but if you think of how a terrorist would operate, very much the same way in terms of it needs to first figure out what exactly is going on, like where it needs to get into. It needs to weaponize in terms of it needs to figure out what malware it needs to use. It needs to put that malware into the system. It needs to detonate that malware, like in some way use that malware for its purpose. And then it needs to get out. Like once that malware has committed the thing that it needs to do, is it stealing information? Is it ruining the system? Whatever it has to do, like there has to be the ending there. And so this cyber kill chain is a really good way for us to understand, kind of to talk about all in the same terms, what exactly is going on in these steps. So not important to like memorize it or have that information, but talking about the cyber kill chain is a very good first step for knowing, either if you're getting a job in cybersecurity or you're speaking with people in this industry, because this is something that is very typically talked about in terms of, the difference between saying that a piece of malware is, used for recon versus it's used just for exfiltrating data. And another way to think of this is, what are all the different things that a piece of malware can do? What are all the different ways that things can be bad? You can, and this is very similar to the industry, the physical industry as well. Denial, disruption, deception, degradation, and destruction. So these are all things that you can do in the physical world, same thing in the cyber world. Essentially, are you going to, I don't know if I can put that in a really simple way, but you guys know what I'm trying to say, right? Like you can do this in the physical world, you can do the exact same thing here. And then the four below are essentially the main counters to that. So are you going to try to detect this malware? Are you going to only delay the impact that it has by trying to mitigate like the amount of time that it takes? Are you going to deter the attack, or are you essentially going to try to make yourself a less appealing target so they will go elsewhere? Or are you going to divert the attention? So those are really kind of the 4 practices of trying to move these away. Again, this is just an interesting way of thinking about when you have a specific malware chain, you have all these different things going on. This is a way to think about how to counter that. So this is one of the pathways for that. One thing that I've talked about but haven't really gone into is indicator of compromise. An indicator of compromise is basically the tool tactic procedure. This is the thing where we say, this is the smoking gun. When we say there is an APT threat activity, how do we know? We have one of these. So indicators of compromise is a hash, which is like a very specific description of a file, or it is a domain, or it is an IP, like a specific computer address. It is one of these specific things, and typically a whole clustering of them, where we say, if you see this activity, this is probably your issue. So the bottom, for example, if you guys remember SolarWinds, there was like that huge supply chain issue that the malware associated with that was Sunburst. And so you see on the left side, you have all those different domains. So you have all those different top level, like when you type in blank.com, like all those different blank.coms. Those are things where we say, this is an issue. This is something associated with bad, and we know that for sure. So that is an indicator of compromise. When we say, okay, if you just have one of those, sometimes that's not it. Say you have a bank robber. He's robbed this bank. He is 6'6", and he's wearing a bright purple shirt, and he's wearing bright red shoes. Just because you have someone then the next day come into the bank with bright red shoes doesn't mean you have a bank robber. It means like he's wearing bright red shoes, so like maybe you look at him funny and you double check. Doesn't mean that he's automatically a bank robber. And the same way, you can't have an indicator of compromise and it not mean malicious activity. But what you are looking for is if that guy who comes in tomorrow has bright red shoes and he's 6'6" and he looks really sketchy, you might say, okay, now I'm seeing a pattern. Now I'm seeing this clustering of indicators that are very similar to other activity I've seen. And so getting into, again, your question about APT activity, a lot of times we won't see the same exact indicators over and over again, but we'll see very similar things. Maybe the guy changed his shirt, maybe he changed his shoes, but for the most part, he's going to recycle most of his outfit. And he's going to do that again and again and again at all these different banks. And he's always going to be 6'6", and he's always going to look sketchy. And so we can use that over and over to determine these types of attacks. And we can use that for attribution. There's nothing important on this slide that you have to read. The interesting thing about this is that when you're looking at this framework, this is called the MITRE ATT&CK framework, very common thing in the industry. This is all the different ways that a person can use, or essentially that you can infiltrate a system, or that you can escalate privileges within a system, essentially anything bad that you can do. We say a framework because there are some things that are not on this list. This list goes all the way down here, but it wasn't going to fit on the slide. The MITRE ATT&CK framework is a very good thing to just be aware of, in the sense of this is kind of the Rosetta Stone that we will use to refer to kind of this basic knowledge base of adversarial tactics. And so things on here that you would be familiar with, you can see phishing is on here. You can see forged web credentials. So when someone kind of like fakes passwords, that kind of thing. Go ahead.
Just a quick question. So for example, there's a brute force technique for credential access. There's a number there, number 4. What does that mean? Why do we put numbers for these techniques? What does that associate?
Let me see. Oh, like these guys right here?
Yeah, like does that have a meaning, or is that just for organizing the column?
Both. So if you were to click on this, there are 4 sub-processes under that. These lists are very, very expansive, and that just kind of says like within that there's different things to do, or like there's different things to explore within that. This is something I really encourage you guys like look up, play with. Again, it's not something that you really need a background and understanding of. You don't have to look at everything and understand what all of this means. The big thing is, again, looking at that framework of, intrusion, of movement, of disruption, of looking at that. If you can say, okay, I know in general, if I were an adversary, this is what I wanted to do. And you say, okay, I also know these are all the different ways I can do it. You kind of have an idea of this is how a bad guy could operate. And to give you a sense of what that actually looks like in terms of what an APT would do, this is the same list, but color coded to say the yellow is one APT, the blue is a second APT, and the green is where those two collide. So directly to your question of when we have one APT and when they have overlap with another, the answer is sometimes it's very, very clear. Whenever we have, these yellow things, we definitely know, like it's definitely not going to be that blue APT. These are solely used by this one APT. However, all those green ones, we really don't know. It could be one, it could be the other, it could be this completely different thing. It's really taking that Venn diagram and saying there's a ton in the middle. However, those few things on the side are really how we can do that attribution. Does this make sense? Cool. And the last thing, I kind of did this on the other slide. I kind of jumped the gun there, but attribution in general, the ability of saying who actually has done this thing. When you take those indicators of compromise, you take those specific things, the red shoes, the 6'6", the purple shirt, and you tie that with the tools, tactics, procedures, the ends, ways, and means. If you take those two things together, you can get attribution. The reason that we rarely do attribution, the reason why the American government very rarely says China hacked us, or the reason that we rarely say, we got pwned by this specific company or this specific government is one, it is a diplomatic nightmare, and two, it is very, very challenging to do. If you look at this list, you might say, that's really easy. Whenever you see a thing in yellow, it's clearly this. But I'm also simplifying it a great deal. There are so many other actors that use all these other things, and then sometimes they just use that one, and then sometimes there's going to be a random person who comes into the bank and he has the purple on and he has the red and he looks sketchy, but it's not the guy. And so there's all these things that combine that make attribution extremely difficult. And so World Economic Forum says the likelihood of detecting and prosecuting perpetrators of cyber attacks in the US is 0.05%. That is assuming all the attribution is done. That is assuming we have everything 100% correct. Within that 0.05% is the then kind of final completion steps of getting a prosecution there. That is also kind of the answer to why when we talk about hacking and we talk about hacking back and we say, why don't we just do the same thing to the people who are doing this to us? If we know that we're getting a distributed denial of service and they're taking down all of our servers, why can't we do the same thing? A lot of times is, well, it's really hard. We don't know. Or if we're sure, we're only kind of sure. Or even if we have both of those things, there's still a lot of complications there. So before I go into the next topic, two kind of thoughts to put it together here. So given everything that we've just learned, talking about saying things like the Russians are hacking elections, when we've said that, we can mean a couple different things with the vectors here, but when we examine the actual attack surface, are we saying, one, that they are that APT committing that long-term espionage activity, those disinformation campaigns, or are we saying they've actually hacked into a system, we're seeing machine compromise, they're getting in there and altering the votes themselves? And so now that you guys kind of have seen the difference between those two, now that you've seen that there kind of is that both that long-term espionage campaign and the ability of, that denial, disruption, et cetera, you can see how those two can be different. The second thing is if you hear your data was involved in a breach, if you get one of those emails, if you get something with that information, I think all of us have gotten that in some way or the other, or we've just heard it on the national news as someone else has, had this happen. this could be your data was in a ransomware attack, an entire system, an entire hospital, an entire what have you. All of that data was in there. And so it was held under ransom, it was deleted, it was whatnot. Or it could mean it is actively in an underground forum being sold. It has the ability to be both. It depends whether it was taken by an actor, a malicious actor who is using it for financial gain, where they are trying to, they are merely trying to extort the main player, or they want to get it in a, or whether they're trying to sell the information off piecemeal. Just hearing your data is involved in a breach, kind of hard to tell the difference, but if you know kind of the difference between all these, all these smaller things, it's a little bit easier to see why kind of blanket statements like this, you might need to press a little bit more. I'm going to leave strategy and get a little bit more into the actual cheat sheet of this. But before I leave strategy, any other general questions? Okay, IPs. So when we talk about an IP address, if you think about a house, if you think about living in a house on a street, when we say an IP, what we are saying is you live at 3,250 Prospect Street. Your IP is the blank dot blank dot blank dot blank, this number that looks like this, an IPv4. And that is classically saying that is how we connect with your computer. When we say computer, we mean a laptop like this, but we also mean a phone, we also mean an iPad, we mean all of these things. So all of these things are all connected to the internet and they change all the time. Because unlike a physical address, unlike living at Prospect Street, these are location-based. There's a couple of things that change. Whenever your internet provider changes, whenever your actual location changes, your IP has the ability to change as well. So right now, my computer has one address, but when I then connect at home, when I'm no longer on the Georgetown address, it connects as a completely different number. So when you hear information about IPs, et cetera, just good to know that it's not like a license plate. You don't keep the same one all the time. It does change. And that plays into, we'll talk a little bit later about proxies and Tor, et cetera. But good to know that. IPv4, IPv6, if you've heard of IPv6, good to know that IPv6 is essentially this nonsense down below. They realized a while ago that the IPv4 numbers were going to run out because we have too many humans with too many computers, too many electronics, and we were going to get rid of, or we were eventually not going to have enough of those numbers. Part of that is because some IPv space is actually allocated for different things. So like the government owns a huge block of IP space. It doesn't just go up sequentially. Blocks of it are owned by universities, like Georgetown has a block. And so eventually we're going to run out of it. So we said, let's make a system that is both a lot more difficult to read, but also has a lot more numbers in it. And so we say IPv6 because there's 6 different little colony things. So cheat sheet, going through a couple different things here. We're going to keep it really simple. We are not going to go into the depths of these. There are entire classes where you can just go down this list and you will spend 6 hours just going down this list. I have done that. It is very painful, but just for things that you need to know in general for living your life. I've said malware 600 million times, but malicious software, malicious software. So any piece of code that is made to do a bad thing, and that is used excessively. Botnet, so a robot network. So I had a little thing, you can't see it because I don't have the what is it called? The animations. I don't have the animations on here, but there was a little thing of The Walking Dead. Think of it as a bunch of zombies. Essentially, a robot network is where you have a chain of computers that have all been infected, and they are all acting on the will of one main network. And so they are all, essentially, it's a lot more powerful for 20 computers or 2,000 computers to do the will versus a single computer to do it. So that's a botnet. You've probably heard the term DDoS before, distributed denial of service. That's leveraging a lot of machines to say they all want to access one website at the same time. So Georgetown is used to a lot of really heavy traffic, especially when you want to register for classes. They're used to saying, 1,000 or 2,000 students are all going to get onto that website all at once to try to register for classes right at that moment. But what if it were 20,000 or 30,000 all at once? Suddenly that load becomes really great. And if it's 200,000 or 300,000, like there just simply is not the ability, the capacity to handle that. So that's a distributed denial of services. C2 is command and control. So if you think of the Godfather image, that's the like a malware controller. That is the guy who is controlling all those botnets. So it's like that main computer and whoever is running that computer. An endpoint is any IP address. It's any computer, it's any laptop, it's any phone, it's any device that is connected to a network. The things that you might not think of as endpoints that are still important are things like washes or a Nest, those kinds of things. The reason that those are important are because a lot of times when we talk about intrusions, we talk about them getting in through the thing with the least amount of security. And things like watches, things like Nests normally don't have the highest amount of security. So laptops are going to be locked down. But Nests, if there's a vulnerability on that, that's a really good way to get into that network. Because once you're in a Nest, you have the ability to get within that internet. Let's see, DNS, domain name server. This is essentially the phone book. This is the thing that says this connects like an IP to like the actual place that you're visiting on the internet. When you go to google.com, you are going to an IP. A domain name server, what it does is it says you typed in Google, what you actually mean are this string of numbers, but you don't need to remember that string of numbers because that's too much. You remember google.com, I'll look it up in the phone book, I'll remember this string of numbers, and I'll do that for you every time. I got you. So DNS is mainly important to know that it's the thing that translates the IPs for you. Sinkholes and honeypots, both important just because they're for what they do for malicious actors. So sinkholes are like a black hole. They are the ones where they will try to trap malicious networks. And in the same way, a honeypot is a website that is made to draw in malicious networks. Both of these are good to get. A sinkhole is essentially just trying to deny and disrupt malware. A honeypot is trying to get an analyst to learn more information about what is going on. So think of it as if you build a fake bank and you see who tries to rob it, you're going to get a lot of information about who those robbers are and how they rob it and what tools they use to break into the bank. And so that's what a honeypot is. That's a lot of terms. I'm trying to be as quick as possible. This is typically like a whole thing. So with going over it really quickly, any questions on that? Does anything not make sense? Go ahead.
This might be a dumb question, but
No.
But you don't know yet. When we talk about things that are connected to like via Bluetooth to the larger internet at large, are those considered like vulnerable endpoints in the same way that like?
Absolutely. So
It's just the means of connection itself into the network. But
yes. So you're asking like whether the fact
if
that
something is not, if the device is not connected to the actual internet, you talk about Chromecast, you talk about Nest, but that actually has an internet connection itself. But I can have a watch that it doesn't actually connect to the internet, but is connected via Bluetooth to my phone or whatever else.
Right.
Is that like sort of equal access, same as something that connected directly to the internet itself as an endpoint, or?
Yes, that is a good question. There still are vulnerabilities. Essentially, if something has the ability to connect to anything else, if it has the ability to connect to any other endpoint, it says weak as its weakest endpoint. So if this can connect to this, if this has vulnerabilities that can, essentially it all goes together, right? That's why if you ever go into a SCIF, a sensitive compartmentalized something facility, into a box, they say no things into the box. It doesn't matter whether it is Bluetooth, whether it's internet connected in any way. They say if it has the ability to connect with any sort of thing, that's why, like that type of philosophy. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Sweet. Another cheat sheet here, taking a little bit broader view into kind of like the verbs and things that you might hear. Red teaming, blue teaming, we talked about this a bit. This is if you are thinking like a bad guy, thinking like a terrorist. This comes from wargaming, where typically the blue team was the good guys, the red team was the bad guys. And so as a good guy, you yourself can be either red team or blue team. You have entire teams, entire sections of a company that can be dedicated just to red teaming. So they constantly say, essentially going around like, how can I mess this up on the daily? That is the job. So red teaming and blue teaming. You have pen testing, penetration testing, and that is saying either physically, cybersecurity, how can I get into a system? That can be saying, you know, if we did a physical pen test of Georgetown, it would be saying, what doors can I get into? How can I socially engineer my way into saying, oh, I lost my card. Like, could you swipe me in here? And then doing that again and again until I get exactly where I need to be into my target. Cybersecurity, that looks like, how can I get into this system? Once I'm into this system, if I don't want to be a regular user, how can I get system admin privileges? How can I get not just the keys to unlock the door, but how can I get the master key ring? Constantly looking at how to kind of improve my access, both physical and cybersecurity. Phishing, I'm sure you guys are all familiar with phishing. This is someone posing as something else in order to get you to click on a link, to go to a place, to download malware, to exfiltrate your resources, to get bad things to happen. So we're all pretty familiar with that term. Bulletproof hosting is a don't ask, don't tell way of being able to host malicious things online. These are people who say, you can host your bad things here, you can host your exploit kits, your ways of detonating malware on my site, and I will not do anything about it. I will just let it exist. And they have a very specific name because kind of it has that malicious intent associated with it. The hosters themselves might not be malicious, but because they are specifically allowing all of this, this malicious, like these malicious things to congregate there, it's called bulletproof hosting. A takedown is when you remove or otherwise get rid of malicious infrastructure. And then a brute force attack is when you think of saying, I need to figure out a password, I need to figure out a username. I'm just going to go through over and over and over and over what exactly it could be. We have all done this in some way, shape, or form. We say we think we know what that password is, but we didn't remember if this one was the one that needed letters or numbers or a combination of letters and numbers. So I don't remember whether this password was Georgetown 1 or Georgetown 1 with a question mark or Georgetown 1 with a question mark and then a 2 after it. You know, like we've been there. Don't lie. We've all been there. And so this is doing that in a very systematic way where a malicious actor will say, essentially with an entire dictionary, go through and say, we are going to figure out what this password is by continuously just like essentially pummeling it with different guesses until we figure out what it is. And the last thing is credential stuffing. Credential stuffing is very similar. It's saying we know we have this list of credentials, we have this list of passwords, and we are just going to apply it again and again and again until we can get into a system. Either way, for those last two, biggest thing to know there are these are different attacks for gaining access into a structure. Nope, this was a whole scroll. Okay, last whole list of cheat sheet things before we move on. This is all malware. This is all very specific. Typically, this is something that I would go through in a lot more detail. We do not need to do that here. The biggest thing you need to know is that when we talk about malicious software, These are all things that are included. To look up the exact difference between what a keylogger is and what is, what a Trojan is, that is something that you can Google. Those things are pretty quick to learn. The biggest thing is knowing that there is a plethora of different types of malware, and a lot of them do not behave the same way. And so you can have things that get into your system and they merely mean to stay there to watch. You can have things that get into your system specifically to listen to everything that your keyboard says, just so they can see what you are typing. You can have things that get into your system specifically to destroy it, to wipe it, to get it completely blank. Or you can have things that get into your system to yank out like a specific type of file. Anytime that you save a PowerPoint file, it will steal that and only that. So those are all, those are examples of all different types of things that malware will do. It is not all the same. It is not all universal. It is constantly different. It is constantly changing. Different actors will use different ones. An example on the right, this is an example of ransomware. So one of the more common things that you might see, but a lot of times these are very hidden things. You will never know that it's on your machine unless it is, it is found by someone specifically looking for it. Any questions, either with this list or the last couple lists? Excellent. So getting into data feeds versus data sets. A data set is when you have a vast library of information. You can walk in, you can pull a book off the shelf, and you can read bits of information. You put the book back on the shelf and you say, okay, cool, that's done. A feed is where anytime any information is updated in a very Harry Potter-esque style, it will send new pieces of information. So it could be every second, it could be every millisecond, it could be every hour. It will constantly give you updates of things. So this is important to know because there are a ton of industries, or there are a ton of companies within the industry that specifically sell feeds. There are a ton of companies within the industry that specifically have data sets. And then there are a ton of companies within the industry that specifically give FinTel, finished intelligence. They give that reporting, like that human readable reporting. When you are looking at a feed, when you are looking at a data set, most of the time it is not English. It is not human readable. I don't have a screenshot of this, but essentially you're looking at lists of indicators. You are looking at millions of lines of things. This is made to essentially go right into a machine that will parse a lot of this information for you. And so when you hear about companies that are doing these things, that are selling these feeds, when they are selling these data sets, biggest thing to know is this is not like a set of data in a social science setting, like something that we would be analyzing as SSP students. This is something that is huge in quantity. Typically, when you go through the analyst life cycle, you will get into like a very, very small number of those things that are actually quality. But you cannot do that by hand. You cannot possibly parse this information by hand, whether it is a feed or a data set. There's simply too much information. So you have to put rules into your machine to say exactly what you're looking for. It will give you that very small result, and then you will go from there. So TLDR, again, feeds and data sets both will give you a large amount of information. Feeds will constantly spit it out as they get that information. Data sets will wait for you to go to them looking for those pieces of knowledge. But either way, the actual human analysis happens later on in the cycle. Examples of where you find these things. When you're looking at human readable reports, when you're looking at things that we could go to right now and say, tell me about advanced persistent threat activity. I want to know more about how, China and Russia are interacting with us. You would go to a place like Mandiant or Recorded Future or IBM or Palo Alto. If you want something that is more a machine readable feed, something that is going to involve the rest of your security process, but not necessarily something that you will look at and get information from you yourself, you've got all these other places. These are, again, they're very they're worthwhile, but they're not things that you want to start out tomorrow and say, this is great, this is something that will start me down my track to cybersecurity, because it's going to be a little bit too difficult to dive into immediately. So SOC, SIM, SOAR, there are three very commonly used things in the process. It took me ages and ages to figure out the difference between these three. A SOC, a Security Operations Center, is a place. So this is the actual place with the humans and the technology in it, which is where people are actively responding to the security incidents. That's where they're detecting, they're looking for these things. And so that's what you call like the place with the people and the things. A SIM, a Security Information Event Management, is like that system for collections. When we're talking about feeds and data sets, we're talking about it feeding into a SIM, into this system that can then kind of collate that information. And then a SOAR is kind of a newer thing that then says, once we have this system in place, it can automatically spit out answers and say, okay, we have this thing, we go to this playbook, we know exactly that we want to do this, this, and this, and we will execute on it. Biggest thing to know, SOC is a place, SIM is the technology that you put a lot of these data sets and feeds into, and then a SOAR is like a very, very fancy SIM that can do a lot of the decision processing for you. So if you see those things, this is the part of the industry where it gets very confusing, because if you look these up, you cannot get a very clear answer. But it is simply knowing the difference between all the industry jargon and just knowing what is what part of this here. So who is in a SOC? When we talk about that Security Operations Center, when we talk about that place, we've got the analysts, who are the people who are actually responding to the incidents. They're the firefighters who are constantly figuring out what's going on. We have the engineers who are building the architecture, so like actually building out the networks, doing the kind of doing that networking there. We have the managers and the leads who are running the processes, the protocols, kind of what we are used to, the same way as kind of like our leads, our taskers, etc. And then we have a CSO, a CIO, a CISO, etc. Kind of that C-suite. So those chief blank officers that are kind of like the heads, the leads of all these things. So when you go to conferences, etc., these are typically the people who are speaking that are saying, you know, this is the grand strategy that we are trying to do for this thing. Most critical thing for you guys to know about this slide is that you have the CISOs, CIOs, CSOs that are typically the people making strategy, and you have security analysts who are going to be the ones saying, I do this on a daily basis, and what I am seeing is blank. And they might be the ones that you are interacting with. They might be the ones who are giving you the most information depending on what you are doing in your varying capacities. Job titles, I will not get into all of these. This is just a mere sampling. When I first started in this field, I really could not get a good handle on who did what, or kind of the things involved with cybersecurity. Because to me, when I was in college, I thought that computer science meant IT. I didn't have a good difference on like how that moved into cyber threat intelligence. And so what I did here was just try to compile kind of a list of these terms, a list of these words. So if you saw it, you kind of had an idea of, okay, so this is more into the cybersecurity role. This is more into what would constitute threat intelligence, what would constitute threat hunting, etc. So nothing to action here, just so you can see these things and say, all right, like this kind of tracks with what I know, or this might be kind of piecing together in my mind what a company would look like, or what these people's jobs would be. This is something that kind of would revolve around that.
Sorry, was like everything in a row, like these you would kind of group like everything in this bullet kind of cover the same thing? Because I know there's a colon, the second one.
The first few were all related,
Yeah.
and then as it went on, I ran out of space. But the first few, yes. And then, so that third one is mainly like analysts, but then getting into pen testing, I just kind of, so it doesn't really help, sorry.
It's very helpful. I haven't looked at the rules yet, but I'm sure it would.
Like if you think of it as a bucket of like networking, bucket of infrastructure,
Got it.
if you think of analysis, incident response and management, et cetera, and I'll get into that in a bit, but essentially just to have these terms. Okay, quick time check, okay. Incident response. If you see the term incident response, if you see that someone is an incident responder, what are they doing? Essentially, they're saying, okay, we have seen this list of IOCs, we have put something together, we think an event is happening, meaning we think we have been breached, we think we have been hacked, we think that this malicious thing has occurred to us and now we need to do something about it. So they are first and foremost, they're looking at planning how they will respond to the event. When they see that an incident is occurring, they're trying to figure out whether, yes, it actually did occur, or no, we think that this is hype and this actually did not happen. They are then going to fix the thing. They're going to patch what they need to do. They are going to change whatever they need to do internally. They are going to stop this from happening, and then they're going to see what they can do next time, whatever they can do better. Think of this as like the firefighting of the cybersecurity world. This is not just the, okay, you know, this fell over, so I'm going to stand it back up. This fell over, I'm going to stand it back up. This is really a constant job of saying, what can we do in the future to make it better? How are we going to respond to this thing if and when it happens? So this is a constant 24/7 job of incident response, planning for future things, etc. The difference between that and threat hunting is assuming that something is already happening. I said here, it's the Mad-Eye Moody of cybersecurity. It is constant vigilance, and it is saying, assuming that something is already there, what can we do to find it? And what can we do to prevent it from happening in the future? So this is constantly saying, I bet there is an APT, so let me check for those signatures, let me check for those IOCs. Or let me try to find anomalies that I can then flag. This is not responding to things. This is not being reactive at all. This is really going out and trying to constantly find new things that you are paranoidly assuming are already happening. So this is a very different approach. This takes a lot more human effort because obviously you first need to have people that are responding to the current things to then be able to be proactive and to say, I have people who can spend the time just looking for things in the future. So this is a threat hunting team. The last thing is malware analysis. This is kind of as far out as we're going to go because this is kind of the very technical piece. But for me, this was the most interesting thing when I moved into cybersecurity. So I wanted to talk about for a brief second. If you think of an unexploded bomb, if you think of an explosive ordnance device person who looks at an unexploded bomb and he says, all right, I see this bomb. It was supposed to go off, but it didn't. Why? They go up to the bomb. They pick it up. Obviously, none of this is logical, but just bear with me for one moment. They pick it up. They look around and they say, okay, well, if you had connected this wire here and this wire here and this wire over here, I see what they were trying to do. Like you could explode it. That's really interesting. Like now let's play with it. Like let's figure out like why were they trying to do it this way? This way is new. I haven't seen a bomb do this. That is what a reverse engineer does. They say, take this malware, and if it worked, like basically deconstruct it and figure out why does it do what it does. And if the malware didn't work and they find this malware sitting there, not working, but supposed to be working, they say, but how can we make it work? And then when it was supposed to work, why was it going to work like that? And what does that say about the people who made it? And so if you think about like, if you want to solve a Rubik's Cube and then you want to take the Rubik's Cube apart and then you want to make it into like an 8 million sided Rubik's Cube, that is what a reverse engineer is. And that's what a malware analyst is. So this is getting very far into the kind of like the art for art's sake level of really looking at what, not the strategy of the attacks, but kind of getting into the whys and wherefores of how these attacks are done, and then stepping back into the, what does this say about the people who are trying to do these attacks? What does it mean? So I say this is getting about as far afield as we can go, because this is a very, very technical role. This is something that you really do need a lot of the kind of the formal schooling for. However, this also can tie to your role as a policymaker, as an analyst, as someone working in these fields, because this does have a lot of implications for, what does it mean that there was this malware? What does it mean that there were these types of things trying to happen? So all of these, whether it's a very technical role or a bit more strategic role, all of these can come back. They can kind of relate to that interesting piece of what does it mean in the bigger picture. So part of your jobs are going to be, basically no matter what you do, is that since you have that knowledge, you have this strategy picture, you have this like affairs, international relations, policy, public science, or political science, you have that aspect of it, is to bring it to these types of roles and say, how to relate these two types of jobs. Getting into CISO, the kind of the last role that I'll talk about here, is a CISO, a CISO, a CIO, kind of that C-suite, like that, those head honchos of these cybersecurity companies. What are they looking for? Why are they interested in cybersecurity? What are they trying to do? TLDR, the first and foremost thing is they're trying to put out fires. The next thing, they're trying to look for they're trying to figure out how to make themselves, their company more secure. So once the fires have been put out, how can they make sure that they don't need to put out fires in the future? How can they have it happen again? The very last thing is, I guess kind of to wrap it together, they're looking at once they've recovered and once they've been able to kind of step out that process, how do they replicate that? So kind of how do they move that on beyond just their stock, beyond just that specific company? How can they translate that? So I put this slide here because if you are working with, or if you're working in a cybersecurity function, or you're working with people in a cybersecurity function, this is something that they're going to be concerned about too, because this is something that their boss is concerned about it, they're concerned about it. If it's something that you guys are going to be working on together as a team, this is something they're going to be concerned about. So it's good to know in general that this is something that they are going to be focused on. And the same way that you might be focused on, finishing a report or getting out a piece of policy. This is the thing that for them is, making the team robust, making other teams robust. Big thing for them. Going to cybersecurity products that we talked about, going to the feeds, the data sets, the tools that all of these people are using, the malware analysts, the threat hunters, the incident responders. What kind of products do they use and how do they use them? Essentially, like, do they just have one product? Like, can I just learn one product and then be done with it? That was my first question, was like, can I just learn one thing and then like never have to learn another cyber thing again? And I put this guy here because the answer is I really, really, really wish that were the case. However, this industry is very interesting and very vast, very convoluted, and there really is no chain of like, you learn this one tool, you learn this one thing, and then it's over. There are a ton of different industries within cybersecurity. And you can go your entire life on one single track and not even look at the other 20 million tracks. Part of this is me trying to show you a bunch of different tracks within this. But there still are a lot of things that I have not covered. So a couple different research tools. The only thing you really need to get from this slide is just that there are a lot of tools. You might have heard of some of these. You might have, like, you might know people who work for some of these. You might have heard some of these tools referenced. So it's just good to know, like Shodan, Census, Gray Noise, Risk IQ, Virus Total, Mandiant, CrowdStrike, Threat Connect, Recorded Future. And I say one or two more because there's like 1,006,000 more. These are just things where you will probably come up against them in your travels. You may have to use them. You may have to learn them. You may have to work with people who have used them and learned them. I know there are some people in this room who have used them and learned them. And so you cannot learn one or two pieces and be done, but you can kind of get a general sense for this is the industry. These are the kinds of players in the industry. It's kind of like for terrorist groups, if you know one or two of the big ones, that's maybe not a great thing to use now that I think about it, but you know what I'm trying to say. Like if you learn one or two of the big players, you can kind of get a sense for what some of these things are. And so in the same way, you can learn a couple of the major companies and say, okay, this is kind of an idea of what some of these companies do. This is a list I stole from Optiv of a technology map. Again, biggest thing you have to get out of this is that there are a lot of different players in this space. And so each of these bars kind of represent a different area of cybersecurity. So we were talking about vulnerability assessment and management. That is specifically saying there are all these different bugs that could be exploited, could be used. We need to patch those, we need to fix those. We talked about incident management and response. Those are the people who say, we have fires, we need to put them out. Threat detection and analysis. Those are the people who will write reports and say, in the grand scheme of things, the strategy with Russia, China, etc. That's this. On and on and on and on. So these are all very different. A lot of these do not touch each other whatsoever. Some of these companies never have to interact. They don't even know what the other ones do. I don't know what many of these things do. And the big thing to get out of this is that not just that the industry is vast, but that because there are so many different pieces, the biggest thing is to really know with what you are working on, with whatever policy you are trying to craft, or with whatever kind of piece of intelligence you are trying to analyze, what are kind of the key things that you need to know? Do you need to know about a major level of strategy? Do you need to know what endpoints are? Do you need to know kind of network security? We don't have a really good ABC list of how to learn the cyber. You can learn software engineering. You can learn network detection, but you can't learn all of this in one fell swoop. So I didn't want to start out with this because I didn't want to freak anybody out, but this is kind of like the good summation of why this industry is a little bit wild and why we kind of did the cheat sheet approach that we did. I just have a couple more slides, but since this is a lot, does anyone have any questions on anything that I just covered? Okay.
What was the bottom left? Refer to the bottom left, you said a thing, but I don't remember what you said it was.
Threat detection and analysis. So last thing, I think this is, there's a comment here for.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, that was just me reminding
Okay.
people.
Okay, great. Great. So we talk about the deep web, we talk about the dark web. That's something that I think comes up in a lot of our classes and it comes up in the news and is worth touching on. When we talk about the surface web, when we talk about OSINT, open source intelligence, when we talk about scraping, we talk about things that we access every single day, whether it's through Twitter, whether it's through Google. There are things that are indexed on the internet, are indexed by search engines like Google, Bing, etc. When we talk about the deep web, we are also talking about things that we do every single day as normal law-abiding humans. When we log on to the georgetown.edu site and we are looking at paying our tuition bill or registering for classes, since we need to use a login for that, that is deep web. Deep web is anything that is personal. It requires a username, password. It is not logged by Google and Bing. You cannot Google your name plus Georgetown and get your financial records page, hopefully. So the deep web just means things that do not have crawlers with them. All of these things are included. I do not have the attribution for this image, but I also found it on the surface web. The difference between the deep web and the dark web is really intention. So the dark web, when we talk about the dark web, we are talking about people who are intentionally doing malicious things. So people who are selling guns, who are selling humans, who are selling contraband materials of whatever way, shape, or form. The most recent statistic we have are there are about 2.5 million people using the dark web every day. And so typically the way that you access the dark web is through proxies, the main one being Tor, the onion router. The onion router has a wide array of uses, kind of like how we talked about cryptocurrency. A lot of people say, well, you have to be using cryptocurrency for like evil things. And people say, well, actually, you can also just use cryptocurrency for like, you know, normal things, buying pizza, whatever. Kind of in the same way, you can use the onion router for non-malicious things. Social rights activists will use it to get their stories out. Journalists will use it. People who live in repressive countries will use it to be able to access the rest of the internet. There are a lot of very good and valid reasons to use Tor, but what it is known for and what there is a huge number of traffic for is for malicious behavior. So I do want to decouple the idea that Tor and the dark web are synonymous, and also make sure that there is a clear differentiation between the deep web and the dark web. So to dive a little bit deeper into Tor, when we talk about VPNs, proxies, and Tor, Tor is a very specific, it's the equivalent of Kleenex and tissues. Tor is like the brand name, like the single thing, the onion router. And what we're looking at is using a bunch of different proxies. A proxy is an intermediary, it's a go-between. It's me saying, I'm not going to talk directly to you, I'm going to talk to you, who's going to talk to you, who's going to talk to you, who's going to talk to you. A proxy is doing that once. Doing it through Tor is doing it like 20 or 30 times. The reason I would want to use a proxy is because if I am going to talk to someone in Argentina, but I don't want them to know that I'm from America, I can talk to someone in Canada. Canada can then talk to Argentina. A lot of us know this because we can use it when we're in a foreign country to access Netflix, that kind of thing. So we use proxies for benign things like that. That is a common use of a proxy. Tor, the reason I bring it up in this conversation is Tor is essentially a Pony Express of, you can say you're in Canada, then you go to America, then you go to Switzerland, then you go to Russia, then you go back to Switzerland, then you go to China. It is very, very, very difficult to then have any attribution. Going back to the idea that attribution is very tricky. It's very difficult to chase all the way back. And so it essentially completely anonymizes your interaction on the web. And so that makes it the ideal use for getting onto the dark web and doing all these malicious activities. That's kind of that obfuscation piece. Again, talking about cybersecurity, there is a whole subset specifically dedicated to looking at the dark web, looking at those things, but decouple it in your mind from, it doesn't always have to be Tor, doesn't have to be the deep web. Just kind of a big thing for your future studies. So there are a lot of things I did not hit. I didn't talk about things like disinformation. I didn't get into a lot of boxes on that Optiv thing. But I did want to say kind of the things that you should take away from this and where I want you to go from here. First of all, there are a lot of classes that Georgetown offers. Some of them are very technically heavy in terms of cybersecurity, but some of them are made more for people who are going into being practitioners. And so worth checking out. I couldn't see the fall 2023 class list, but they typically offer like a solid number. So it's worth looking into those, even if it's not something that you want to do with your life, just to get like a better grounding here. For certifications, if you want to get a little bit more into cybersecurity, you don't want to take the full leap, you still want to do like whatever job you're pursuing, whatever things you're pursuing, CompTIA A+ is the first one to start out with. It then leads into Security Plus, which is kind of like the major one, but CompTIA A+ is like that very beginning step of, I want to have something that is universally recognized on my resume for the cyber thing. CISSP is kind of like the next bar of, I do the cybersecurity things. Those are kind of like the two big ones. Two trade shows that I could think of off the top of my head in DC. CyberWarCon is started by a Georgetown professor, Josh Hultquist. I recommend that one, as well as MWise, which is held, I think, in the fall every year. And I think both, I know MWise, if you have an EDU account, you should be able to get into it for free. Trade shows elsewhere, Black Hat and RSA are the two really big ones. So if your company has any ability to get into those, if you have any ability to do this for professional development, those are two ones to look into. And jobs, if this is something where you want that list of things, if any of this is of interest to you, please let me know. Please send me an email. I'm happy to go over resumes. I'm happy to troubleshoot with you kind of what jobs you would look at for entry-level positions in anything like this. This is something where if you don't have a background in software engineering, network engineering, it can be scary to initially get into, but this is also something that the skills we have, the strategy piece of it, the international relations piece of it, this is a really critical thing that honestly a lot of cybersecurity employers are looking for, because we have that skill set that a lot of people don't have because they haven't been thinking of it from that same angle. So really important thing, I think you should consider it. But that is all I have. So thank you so much, Georgetown, for hosting me and opening it up to any questions.
Can I just mention
Yeah.
that I think fall S3 offers a Python class.
Outstanding. Yes. Okay. Good, good, good.
There's also the CompTIA Security Plus, they're doing like a boot camp right now. There's like for the CSI on campus.
Yes,
They're doing that, although it's difficult if you haven't done it before.
but it's still, I did it when I was here, definitely worth it. Like even if you just go to the first couple and let it wash over you to get a sense of it, I'm a big fan of doing that just to like dip your toe into the water. Yes, good. Good.
There's a lot of washing over.
And that's okay. That's okay. Anyone else? Awesome. Thank you guys so much for coming.